I ran into an old colleague at a coffee shop last week, though he wasn't actually drinking coffee. He was sitting there with a bottle of room temperature water, looking like he'd just finished a marathon he hadn't signed up for. His eyes were darting around, his leg was tapping a frantic rhythm against the table, and he looked pale, almost vibrating with a strange, jittery energy. When I asked how he was, he leaned in and whispered, "I'm on day 4 of a total dopamine fast. No caffeine, no music, no flavor. I'm resetting the receptors." He said it with this intense missionary zeal, like he'd discovered the secret to eternal life. To him, every spark of pleasure was a poison he had to purge to finally become a high performer. He was convinced that by starving his senses, he was finally taking control of his hustle. But then a tray of fresh cinnamon rolls came out of the oven nearby. The scent hit the air, sweet, warm, and heavy. For a split second, his face transformed, his eyes glazed over with a look of pure, unadulterated longing. Then, just as quickly, his expression soured into something bitter, almost aggressive. He started complaining about how weak the people in the shop were for needing that sugar hit, even getting visibly angry at the barista for the sensory overload of the music playing. He was so busy celebrating his own misery and his clean system that he didn't realize he was actually falling apart. That immediate shift from claiming total mental clarity to displaying a raw, irritable aggression was startling. It made me realize that his reset wasn't actually bringing him back to balance. It was just replacing a natural reward system with a much more dangerous, invisible stress. He thought he was mastering his biology, but he was actually just drowning in cortisol, becoming dopey in his pursuit of being disciplined. It raises the question, why are we so obsessed with killing the very chemical that fuels our motivation, and what happens when the hype man in our brain finally goes silent?
That is, wow. And it's almost a perfect allegory for this whole cultural moment we're in, isn't it?
It felt like watching a science experiment in real time. I think everyone listening probably gets the impulse.
Completely. We're all so overstimulated, so distracted. The idea of a reset, of just wiping the slate clean, it's incredibly appealing.
So the logic on the surface feels sound. If I'm addicted to these little dopamine hits from my phone or from sugar, well, the solution must be to just cut them all off.
Right. It treats the brain like a muscle you've strained. You just need to rest it.
But that's where the fundamental misunderstanding comes in, right? Because it's not a muscle.
It's not a muscle, and it's not a bank account either. You can't just stop making withdrawals and expect the balance to go up. The brain is an ecosystem. And it hates a vacuum.
So by taking away all the good stuff, all the rewards...
He wasn't creating a state of calm neutrality. He was creating a state of profound deprivation. And the brain interprets that as a threat. It thinks you're in a famine. It thinks you're isolated from the tribe. It thinks you're in danger.
And its response to danger is...
to flood the system with the only emergency fuel it has. Cortisol. Stress hormones. He wasn't fasting from dopamine. He was force-feeding himself cortisol.
Which explains the aggression, the jitteriness, the paranoia. He wasn't enlightened. He was in fight or flight.
He was a cornered animal. And that's the trap of this whole hustle culture interpretation of neuroscience. We've misunderstood the key player. Dopamine isn't just the pleasure chemical. That's such a bad, oversimplified name for it.
So what is it then, if it's not pleasure?
It's motivation. It's the engine of wanting. It's the chemical that tells you, hey, that thing over there is worth getting up and moving for. It's the hype man, like you said. It builds anticipation for the future.
Without the hype man, there's no show.
There's no show. There's just apathy. And to get yourself to do anything in a state of apathy, you have to find another motivator. And the only one left is fear. The fear of failure, the fear of falling behind. So you whip yourself with cortisol to get things done.
You trade the carrot for the stick, and then you wonder why you feel terrible all the time.
You're celebrating misery and calling it discipline. And that's really the starting point for our whole deep dive today.
We have to start with that biological mess, what was physically happening inside that guy's head. We need to talk about the HPA axis, the receptors, really get into the weeds of burnout.
The nuts and bolts of the breakdown.
Because for every person trying to fix their biology with a dopamine fast, there's someone else looking at the same problem and saying, the biology is the problem, let's get rid of it.
And that takes us into the world of effective accelerationism, BCIs, transhumanism, the technological solution.
A much more extreme solution, which then leads to a massive societal conflict. Do we hit the accelerator or do we slam on the brakes?
The Prometheans versus the safetyists.
And if we follow that thread all the way to the end, if the accelerators win, what does a human being even look like in a world where we've solved the biological problem of motivation?
What happens after the hustle?
Yeah.
It's a journey. from a guy in a coffee shop.
All the way to a Dyson sphere. The biology, you mentioned cortisol. Most people think of stress as adrenaline, a sudden jolt. What's the difference?
Yeah. So your body has two major stress response systems. The first one is the one everyone knows, the fight or flight system.
Yeah.
Its technical name is the SAM system, sympatho-adrenomedullary.
CAM.
SAM is fast. It's all about adrenaline or epinephrine. A car cuts you off in traffic. Your heart pounds, your pupils dilate, you're instantly alert. It's an electrical signal. It's almost instantaneous.
It's the lightning strike. It happens and it's over.
Exactly. But the second system is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. This is the heavy artillery.
So if SAM is a sniper rifle, HPA is a siege cannon?
It's slower. It takes maybe 20 to 30 minutes to really get going. This system doesn't run on adrenaline. It runs on cortisol. And its job isn't the immediate jump. It's long-term endurance.
So this is the system that would keep you going if you were, say, lost in the woods for 3 days.
That is its evolutionary purpose. Cortisol mobilizes your glucose reserves, giving you energy. It suppresses your immune system and your digestive system because, look, you don't need to be fighting off a cold or digesting lunch when you're trying to outrun a predator. It saves energy for the critical task of survival.
The problem is, our brain doesn't know the difference between a predator in the woods and a mean email from our boss.
It has no idea. To your ancient brain, a threat is a threat. So the HPA axis fires for the email. It fires for the traffic jam. It fires when you're doom scrolling the news. And it definitely fires when you're on day 4 of starving your senses in a coffee shop.
And unlike being lost in the woods, these modern stressors don't end. The threat is chronic. The HPA axis never gets the all-clear signal to shut down.
And that's when this life-saving system becomes incredibly destructive. You mentioned the word dissolve earlier. Duration. Chronic cortisol literally changes the structure of your brain.
How? What does it actually do?
This is where we get to the called the diamond model of the neural stress response. It's a really useful way to picture it.
The diamond model?
Yeah. So imagine your brain's processing power is a finite resource, like the power in a city grid. When a major stress event happens, the brain acts like a city manager in an emergency. It has to reroute power.
It initiates a brownout in some neighborhoods to keep the hospitals running.
So cortisol is the signal for this emergency rerouting. And it systematically shuts down power to the luxury neighborhood, which is the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
The CEO's office, the part that does long-term planning, rational thought, emotional regulation, impulse control, all the stuff that makes you a modern human.
It goes dark. The neurons literally become less active. This is why when you're super stressed, you can't think straight. You can't make a complex decision. You snap at people. Your CEO is offline.
And where does all that power go?
It all gets rerouted to the emergency services, the brain's fear center, the security guard, as you put it.
So the planner goes quiet and the alarmist gets a megaphone.
And a spotlight. The amygdala becomes hyperactive. It starts scanning for threats everywhere. It encodes emotional memories with incredible vividness. I mean, this is why you can't remember what you were supposed to do at work, but you can remember exactly the tone of voice your partner used that made you angry.
That's the diamond model. Power away from the PFC, power towards the amygdala. Your colleague at the coffee shop. He wasn't thinking, he was just reacting. The barista wasn't a person, she was a threat. The music wasn't background noise, it was an attack.
He was in a state of hypervigilance. His brain was optimized for a war zone, not a coffee shop. But the mechanism is even more elegant and more tragic when you look at the cellular level, at the receptors themselves.
Okay, this is the MR and GR stuff. Mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoid receptors.
Right, so cortisol is the messenger, but it can't do anything until it's read by a receptor. It has to bind to something.
Right.
And there are two main types.
Yeah, the MRs first.
Okay, think of the mineralocorticoid receptors, the MERs, as the on switch or maybe the vigilance switch. They have a super high affinity for cortisol.
Meaning they're really sticky.
Very sticky. They'll grab onto cortisol even when there are only tiny amounts of it floating around. So under normal, non-stressed conditions, your MERs are pretty much always active. They're what keep you alert and aware. They help you appraise your environment. They're the baseline.
They keep the lights on in the security office.
Right. Now, then you have the glucocorticoid receptors, the GRs. These are the off switch, the recovery switch.
And these ones are less sticky.
Much less sticky. They have a low affinity. They only really start binding to cortisol when the levels get very, very high. So when that car swerves at you and your HPA axis kicks in and floods your brain with cortisol,
That's when the GRs wake up.
that's when they activate. And their job is crucial. Once they bind all that cortisol, they send a negative feedback signal back to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. It's a message that says, okay, message received. There's plenty of stress hormone in the system. We can stop making more now.
So the GR is the fire extinguisher. The stress happens, cortisol spikes, the GRs activate, and they put out the fire, bringing the system back to normal.
In a healthy, functioning system, yes. Yeah. But now, imagine your colleague. He's not experiencing a single acute stressor. He's living in a self-imposed state of chronic stress. The cortisol isn't just spiking, it's high all the time.
So the GRs, the fire extinguishers, are just being sprayed constantly.
Constantly. They are getting absolutely hammered. And just like with any receptor system, if you overwhelm it with too much signal for too long, the brain's defense mechanism is to downregulate.
It starts pulling the fire extinguishers off the wall because the alarm won't stop ringing.
It literally removes the receptors or makes them less sensitive. It's trying to protect itself from the overwhelming signal. But in doing so, it breaks the most important part of the entire system.
The off switch?
The off switch. Now, you no longer have an effective way to stop the cortisol production. So you get stuck in a terrifying feedback loop. You're stressed, so you produce cortisol. But the mechanism to stop producing cortisol is broken. So you just keep making more.
And that is burnout. It's not just feeling tired. It is a physiological state of a broken feedback loop.
It's a structural failure. Your brain has lost its ability to return to baseline. And this finally brings us back to the dopamine, because this ocean of cortisol has devastating effects on the brain's reward system.
The nucleus accumbens.
Right. Chronic stress, high levels of cortisol, they desensitize your dopamine D2 receptors. So even if you do something that should be rewarding, you don't feel it as strongly. The pleasure is blunted, the motivation is gone.
So you work incredibly hard, you finally achieve the goal, you get the promotion, you finish the project, and you feel nothing.
Anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. And this creates the most vicious cycle of all, because your brain, in its simplicity, thinks, well, I didn't get the reward. I must not have tried hard enough.
So you double down, you hustle harder, you grind more.
Which produces more cortisol, which further breaks your GR receptors, which further desensitizes your dopamine receptors. It's a death spiral. And it's what I call the organized lie of hustle culture. It tells you to push through the pain, but the biological reality is that pushing through just makes you less capable of ever feeling the reward.
We are running ancient hardware that was designed for the savannah, and we're trying to use it to trade stocks or write code, and it's just breaking.
The hardware is not fit for purpose anymore. And that is the argument made by a whole new school of thought. They look at this biological bottleneck and they don't say, let's meditate more. They say, let's replace the hardware.
Which brings us to Elias. This story for me is the absolute endpoint of the biohacking impulse we saw in the coffee shop. It's not about fasting anymore. It's about fundamental reengineering. In the glass-walled offices of Palo Alto, Elias watched the data streams flicker across his retina through a thin neural overlay. For years, his career had been a pendulum swinging between the height of a breakthrough and the crushing weight of cortisol-induced burnout. His biology was a bottleneck. His ancient brain reacted to a market dip as if a predator were in the bushes, flooding his system with stress hormones that clouded his judgment. Then came the decoupling. Through a series of targeted neuropharmacological adjustments and a high-bandwidth brain-computer interface, his drive was finally liberated. He could feel the dopamine, the cold, clean hunger for progress, without the paralyzing interference of the fight-or-flight response. He sat in silence for 18 hours, his mind a frictionless engine of optimization, accelerating toward a technological horizon that his unaugmented colleagues couldn't even perceive. He wasn't just working, he was evolving into the precursor of the singularity. I heard about the decoupling protocols recently, and it's fascinating how we view this. From the outside, it looks like Elias is sacrificing his humanity to become a high-performance machine. But if we look at it through the lens of evolutionary stagnation, isn't it actually more human to want to shed the biological glitches that hold us back? We've spent millennia being slaves to stress hormones that were meant for the savannah, not the stars. While the idea of stripping away feelings like stress might seem extreme in the race for the singularity, being able to think without the biological handbrake of burnout isn't just an advantage, it's a necessity.
The cold, clean hunger for progress.
Yeah.
It's both incredibly alluring and deeply, deeply unsettling.
It's the core of this whole philosophy, this idea of ETOC, or effective accelerationism. It's a term I see everywhere now, but I think a lot of people just think it means let's build tech faster. It's almost a religion.
It's a complete cosmological framework. The argument, if you really boil it down, is based on thermodynamics and the purpose of life in the universe.
Okay, that's a big leap from I'm burned out.
It is,
Yeah.
But it's a logical one. in their view. The reasoning goes something like this. The universe tends towards entropy, towards disorder, but life is this weird counter-entropic force. It captures energy from the sun, from chemical vents, and it uses that energy to build complexity, to build order.
So life is fighting against the heat death of the universe.
And the Edomite perspective says that this isn't just something life does, it's what life is for. The purpose of intelligent life, specifically, is to accelerate this process, to maximize energy capture and consciousness, to climb what they call the Kardashev gradient.
The Kardashev scale, type 1, 2, and 3 civilization.
Exactly. A type 1 civilization harnesses all the energy of its planet. Type 2, its star. Type 3, its galaxy. For an accelerationist, our moral imperative, our cosmic duty, is to get up that ladder as fast as possible.
And our biology, our messy, cortisol-soaked emotional biology, is holding us back.
It's the bottleneck. It's a bug in the code. It's legacy hardware. For Elias, feeling fear about a market dip isn't a human experience to be cherished. It's an evolutionary error that reduces his efficiency and slows down the climb.
So the decoupling is him debugging himself, separating the useful chemical, dopamine for motivation, from the buggy chemical, cortisol for stress.
He's performing a targeted neurochemical lobotomy to become a better servant to the thermodynamic purpose of the universe. But from his perspective, it's the most rational thing in the world.
Let's talk about the actual tech that would make this possible. We're talking about brain-computer interfaces, BCIs. People have seen the Neuralink demos. Is this really plausible?
The medical side is already here, and it's miraculous. We have devices that allow paralyzed people to control robotic arms or type with their minds. That's restoring function. But the next step, the one Elias is taking, is what the literature calls EBCIs, enhancement brain-computer interfaces.
Not just fixing, but upgrading.
Upgrading. And we're not just talking about memory like downloading information. The real game changer, the one relevant to this discussion, is the ability to directly modulate your own neural circuits.
So like having a volume knob for different parts of your brain?
Imagine having an interface where you can literally turn down the activity in your amygdala. You just dial down the fear, dial down the anxiety. Yeah. At the same time, you can dial up the activity in the pathways between your PFC and your nucleus accumbens.
You could literally turn on a flow state on command.
And keep it on for 18 hours. All the distractions, all the background noise, the emotional volatility, it all just fades away. You are left with just the signal. The cold, clean hunger for progress.
The problem my colleague had in the coffee shop, being overwhelmed by sensory input, would just cease to exist for Elias.
He could be in the middle of a rock concert and have the mental silence of a monastery, if he chose. He would have total executive control over his own subjective experience.
Okay, I have to push back on this because it sounds like a nightmare. It sounds like the end of what it means to be human. If you can just turn off fear or sadness, are you even alive? And what about free will? If I'm dialing up my own motivation, am I choosing to be motivated?
You're hitting on the core philosophical and ethical crisis here. And it gets even worse. There's a term for the most extreme risk: brainjacking.
Brainjacking. That's a horrifying word.
It's the idea that if your BCI is networked, and for high bandwidth thought, it would have to be, it's hackable. And if a third party, a corporation, a state actor, can gain write access to your neural interface,
they could write commands directly into your brain?
They could associate a dopamine release with seeing their company's logo. They could induce a spike of anxiety when you think about a political rival. It wouldn't feel like a command. It would feel like your own genuine emotion, your own authentic desire. You would be a puppet who not only loves his strings, but believes he invented them.
That's the end of the individual. And even if we solve that, what about the inequality?
The biological divide.
Yeah.
If this technology costs $1 million, the gap between the rich and the poor stops being about money and starts being about species. How can an unaugmented human possibly compete in an economy with a workforce of Eliases who don't sleep, don't burn out, and can think 1,000 times faster?
You become a protected class, a pet, living in a sort of human national park while the post-humans run the universe.
It's a genuine speciation event driven by capitalism. And then there's the final risk, which is maybe the most subtle: mental monoculture.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we all start optimizing our brains for efficiency and progress, as defined by a tech company in Silicon Valley, do we all start to think the same? Do we lose cognitive diversity? Do we engineer out the daydreamer, the dissenter, the melancholic artist, because their brain states aren't optimal?
You'd create a perfectly efficient society that has no idea what it's being efficient for.
A frictionless engine running in a vacuum. So these are the stakes. And it's precisely these risks that have given rise to this massive counter-movement. For every Elias trying to hit the gas, there's a powerful force trying to find the brakes.
Which is where Clara comes in. She's standing on the other side of this chasm, looking at the same future, but seeing only danger. Clara stood before a regulatory board in Brussels, listening to a lecture on the ethics of human tempo. The committee members spoke passionately about safetyism, arguing that the new wave of cognitive accelerators threatened the natural balance of society. They wanted to cap neural processing speeds to ensure well-being and mental hygiene, effectively building a bureaucratic cage around human potential. To Clara, their words sounded like a death knell for the Promethean spirit. These regulators weren't protecting people, they were managing decline. They were terrified of a world where the risk of acceleration might actually lead to the end of scarcity. As she walked out of the hall, she looked at the stagnant city around her and realized that the safety they craved was just a comfortable name for the slow extinction of the spirit of expansion. I saw a thread online discussing these safetyism policies, and it's a classic conflict between the urge to protect and the urge to prevail. From a social justice perspective, we want to make sure no one is left behind or forced to accelerate. But the effective accelerationism perspective asks a harder question. At what point does protection become stagnation? If we had prioritized this level of risk aversion in the past, we'd still be debating the safety of the steam engine while shivering in the dark. It's a polarizing stance, but we have to ask if our obsession with biological balance is actually a fear of our own greatness.
Managing decline. That's the phrase that the Ectos crowd uses constantly. They see this whole regulatory push not as a noble effort to prevent dystopia, but as an act of profound civilizational cowardice.
But let's give the regulators, the safetyists, their due. Isn't a board discussing the ethics of human tempo a good thing? Shouldn't we be thinking about these risks before we let everyone plug in? The risk of brain-jacking alone seems to justify some caution.
Of course. And the Steelman argument for safetyism is based on what's called X-risk, or existential risk. The idea is that technology is becoming so powerful, particularly AI and biotech, that one mistake doesn't just cause a disaster, it could cause the extinction of humanity.
So if the downside is literally everything, you have to be infinitely cautious.
It's the precautionary principle. The burden of proof must be on the innovator to prove their invention is 100% safe, rather than on the regulator to prove it's dangerous. First, do no harm.
Which sounds completely reasonable on its face.
It does. But the accelerationist counterargument is that doing nothing is not a neutral act. Doing nothing is also a choice, and it has a cost. They argue that by not developing these technologies, we are choosing to let billions of people suffer and die from things like aging, disease, and poverty.
So it becomes a trolley problem. Do you pull the lever to accelerate, potentially creating a future existential risk, or do you do nothing, guaranteeing that the trolley continues on its current path, killing millions every year from status quo problems?
And the accelerationists have this historical data point they always bring up, which is the Henry Adams curve.
Right, about energy consumption.
Exactly. Henry Adams, back at the turn of the 20th century, noticed that human energy use was exploding exponentially. We were on this incredible upward curve from wood to coal to oil. It looked like we were headed for the stars. And then around 1970, the curve just flattens.
What happened?
Well, the EAC argument is that what happened wasn't a failure of physics or engineering. It was a failure of will. A cultural shift. We had the rise of the environmental movement, the anti-nuclear movement. We had Chernobyl. We got scared.
We chose safety over power. They call it ergophobia, right? Fear of energy.
Ergophobia. And Claire's argument in that story is that we are making the exact same mistake now with AI and BCIs. The regulators in Brussels are so terrified of the potential risks of cognitive enhancement that they're strangling the potential benefits in the crib. Benefits like curing Alzheimer's, solving climate change, ending scarcity forever.
So in her view, they aren't protecting humanity. They're condemning it to a slow, managed decline because they're afraid of greatness.
It's a really difficult needle to thread, and it's complicated by what you could call the Machiavelli effect. Machiavelli wrote that the innovator has a very hard time because his enemies are all those who are doing well under the old system.
And his defenders are lukewarm because they don't yet see the benefits of the new system.
Exactly. The regulators, the people whose jobs might be threatened, the ethicists who are worried, they exist right now. They can vote, they can lobby, they can protest. But the beneficiaries of acceleration, the generations who might be cured of cancer by an AI, the people who would live in a world without work, they don't exist yet. They are hypothetical.
So the political gravity always pulls towards slowing down, towards safety.
It's the path of least resistance. which is why the accelerationists are so aggressive. They see themselves as fighting a necessary countercultural war against a default setting of stagnation.
But surely there's a middle path. Can't we innovate and regulate?
The answer would be no. They'd say that regulation, by its nature, is too slow. Bureaucracy can't keep up with exponential technological growth. By the time a committee in Brussels agrees on the rules for version 1.0 BCI, the engineers in Palo Alto will be on version 4.0, and the rules will be obsolete. They believe the only way to make powerful technology safe is with more and better technology.
The only way out is through.
You have to build a better AI to defend against a rogue AI. You have to build better neural security to prevent brainjacking. You can't solve it with a policy paper.
Let's say Claire wins. Elias gets his wish, the regulators are pushed aside, and we accelerate full throttle into the future. We get the BCIs, we build the AGI, we solve energy, we end scarcity, we win the game. What happens the day after we win?
That might be the most terrifying question of all.
Here.
What is the purpose of humanity in a world where the problem of survival has been solved?
It's the post-scarcity paradox. Our entire biology, our entire culture, our entire psychology is built around struggle. The struggle for food, for status, for survival. If you take that away, what's left?
Do we just become the Eloi from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine? Just passive, beautiful, useless creatures waiting to be harvested? Or do we find something new to strive for?
This is where we meet Kaito on his Dyson sphere. He represents the hopeful answer to that question. Try to imagine Kaito, a maintenance architect on a fledgling Dyson sphere. In his world, the hustle is a relic of a primitive past. There is no rent to pay, no hunger to satisfy, and no social hierarchy based on the scarcity of resources. On Earth, Kaito's ancestors were driven by dopamine loops tied to survival, finding food, gaining status, avoiding death. But for Kaito, the motivation system has shifted entirely. His dopamine is triggered by the elegant solution of a cosmic engineering problem or the acquisition of a new piece of fundamental physics knowledge. He spends decades monitoring the solar collectors, driven not by the fear of failure, but by a profound post-scarcity curiosity. His mind is tuned to the frequency of a civilization that has finally outgrown the stress-reward cycle of its planetary cradle. I've been reading a lot about the psychological shift required for a Dyson-scale civilization, and it's hard to wrap our heads around a life without struggle. We often define our humanity by what we overcome, but Kaito's story suggests that once we solve the survival puzzle, we don't just stop it. We move from the dopamine of having to the dopamine of knowing. It sounds utopian, almost alien, but perhaps that's the ultimate goal of all this acceleration, to finally reach a point where our brains are wired for the infinite expansion of the universe rather than the finite limitations of the Earth.
A maintenance architect on a Dyson sphere. I mean, the sheer scale of that idea. He's not working for a paycheck. He's not working to avoid homelessness. He's a gardener for a star.
And this is the fundamental psychological pivot that has to happen for a post-scarcity society to not just collapse into nihilism. It's the shift from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation.
So you could break that down.
Right now, almost everything we do is driven by extrinsic or external motivators. You go to work to get money. You follow the rules to avoid punishment. You post on social media to get likes. The reward is separate from the action.
It's transactional, a means to an end. Exactly. And that entire system is predicated on scarcity. I have something you want, you have something I want, so we trade. But what happens when an advanced AI and robotics can provide everything for free? Food, housing, healthcare, entertainment. The transactional model becomes meaningless.
So there's nothing to trade for. So what motivates you to get out of bed?
The only thing left is intrinsic motivation, doing an activity purely for the satisfaction of the activity itself. Kaito isn't maintaining the Dyson sphere to get something. He's doing it because he finds the act of solving cosmic engineering problems inherently rewarding.
The work is its own reward.
But here's the problem. We see evidence everywhere that humans are interested. Well, that we are terrible at this. Look at what happens to many people who win the lottery or retire early without a plan.
They fall apart. Depression, addiction, ennui. They lose their sense of purpose because the struggle that defined them is gone.
It's the crisis of purpose. We are problem-solving machines. If you take away all the real problems, we don't relax into a state of bliss. We invent new, often self-destructive problems just to have something to push against.
To my colleague in the coffee shop, his life was objectively safe, comfortable, and abundant. He invented a struggle. He created an artificial scarcity, a scarcity of flavor, of music, of dopamine, just so he could feel like he was overcoming something.
He was simulating the savannah in a Starbucks. He was trying to feel alive. Kaito represents the next evolutionary step of the human mind, a mind that has learned to derive that feeling of aliveness, not from simulated survival, but from genuine curiosity and creation.
He doesn't need to fight a fake battle because he's engaged in a real, albeit very different, kind of challenge.
Exactly the point. A post-scarcity life isn't about blissful carelessness. It's not hedonism. True, deep satisfaction comes from what psychologists call effortful concentration, from tackling a challenge that is right at the edge of your abilities, a state of flow.
So Kaito still has challenges, massively complex ones. He still experiences effort and concentration. The difference is he doesn't have stress.
He doesn't have existential stress. He is not driven by the fear of death or deprivation. He's driven by the desire to understand, to build, to expand. This is the ultimate goal of Elias's decoupling, to surgically remove the cortisol of survival fear so that the pure, clean dopamine of curiosity can be applied to an infinite canvas.
The motivation shifts from the dopamine of having things, having money, having status, to the dopamine of knowing things, knowing how a star works, knowing a new piece of mathematics.
And the dopamine of knowing is a potentially infinite wellspring. You can run out of things to own. You can never run out of things to understand. That's a motivation system that can last a species for 1 billion years.
So when you trace the whole arc, it's really something. We start with the colleague in the coffee shop, a biological mess, totally confused, mistaking stress for discipline, drowning his dopamine system in cortisol.
Here's the problem statement, the biological bottleneck.
Then we get Elias. He's the technological fix, the attempt to solve the colleague's problem with the BCI, to physically separate motivation from fear.
The hardware upgrade.
Which leads to Clara and the great societal conflict, the battle between the Prometheans who want to accelerate that upgrade and the safetyists who want to regulate it into stagnation.
The war for the future of human evolution.
And finally, if the accelerators win, we arrive at Kaito. He's the destination. He is the psychological software that has to be running on the new hardware. A mind that no longer needs the fear of survival to feel a sense of purpose.
He finds his drive in the pure act of cosmic expansion and knowledge acquisition.
And it brings it all full circle. That dopamine fast, in a way, was just a clumsy, primitive, almost religious attempt to get to Kaito's state of mind.
He wanted the purity of focus, the mental clarity. But he was using the broken tools of scarcity and deprivation to try and get there. He was trying to subtract his way to enlightenment.
When the real path is to add, to build, to accelerate not just our technology, but our very definition of what is worth wanting.
It seems the true challenge isn't just about building faster computers or neural implants. It's about whether we can fundamentally rewrite the source code of our own motivation.
We're stuck in the middle, aren't we? We're the missing link between the cortisol-driven animal that huddled in caves and the dopamine-driven architect of the stars.
And all this friction we feel, the burnout, the anxiety, the dopey behavior in the coffee shop, it's not a sign that we're broken. It's just the growing pains of a species, trying to decide if it's finally ready to leave the cradle.